The wind howled like a wounded animal across the Wyoming plains, carrying with it the bite of winter that cut through even the thickest wool. Elias Gentry stood at the edge of his property, watching the snow gather in drifts against the weathered fence posts. 3 winters had passed since Martha and little James were laid to rest beneath the lone oak tree on the hill. Yet the ache in his chest remained as raw as the day he dug their graves with his own hands. The scarlet fever had taken them both within a week of each other. Martha, with her cornflower eyes and gentle hands, had gone first, whispering prayers until her voice gave out. James hadn't even lived long enough to speak his first word. Now, at 34, Elias felt ancient, hollowed out by grief and the relentless demands of the land. His ranch sat in a valley south of the Wind River Range, surrounded by pine forests that stretched dark and endless toward the mountains. At night, wolves sang their lonely songs, and Elias found a strange kinship in their mourning. He'd bought the property from the estate of his late grandfather, Josiah Gentry, a man he'd barely known but whose name still carried weight among the old-timers in town. The nearest settlement, Bitter Creek, lay a day's ride north. Elias made the journey once a month for supplies, speaking to no one beyond what commerce required. The townsfolk had learned to leave him be, though he sometimes caught their pitying glances when they thought he wasn't looking. The preacher had stopped calling after Elias told him, in terms that would have made Martha blush, exactly what he thought of a God who stole wives and babies from decent men. On this particular December morning, with the thermometer reading well below freezing and his breath forming clouds in the air, Elias decided to tackle the old horse barn. The structure had been listing to one side since he'd arrived, its roof partially caved in from decades of heavy snow. He'd been putting off the repairs, but with another storm brewing on the horizon, he couldn't afford to lose what little shelter remained for his animals. The barn smelled of old hay and mouse droppings. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through gaps in the walls. Elias set to work clearing out the accumulated debris, his movements methodical and purposeful. Physical labor was the only thing that quieted his mind these days, the only respite from memories that haunted him worse than any ghost. He was prying up a section of rotted floorboards when his crowbar struck something unexpected, not the packed earth he'd anticipated, but wood, solid wood that rang hollow when he tapped it. Curious now. Elias cleared away more boards until he'd exposed what appeared to be a trap door, its surface scarred with age and secured with rusted iron hinges. The door had been nailed shut. The nail heads pounded flat as if someone had been determined it should never be opened. Elias paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. Every instinct told him to cover it back up, to leave well enough alone. But something, call it boredom, call it the perverse curiosity that comes from having nothing left to lose, made him fetch his hammer and begin working the nails free. They came out reluctantly, screeching protests that set his teeth on edge. When the last nail clattered to the floor, Elias gripped the edge of the door and heaved. It opened with a groan, revealing a narrow wooden staircase descending into darkness. The smell hit him first, damp stone mixed with something else, something metallic and old that made his stomach turn. Elias fetched a lantern from his saddlebags and lit it with shaking hands. The circle of light barely penetrated the gloom below, but he could make out stone walls, expertly fitted without mortar in the old style. Each step down felt like a descent into another world. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the walls seemed to press in from all sides. At the bottom, Elias found himself in a small chamber, perhaps 10 feet square. The floor was stone as well, worn smooth in places as if by the passage of many feet. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, details began to emerge that made his blood run cold. Iron rings bolted to the walls, scratches in the stone that looked disturbingly like claw marks, dark stains on the floor that no amount of time could completely erase. In one corner sat what remained of a narrow cot, its metal frame twisted and rusted. But it was the chains that made Elias's hand tremble as he held the lantern higher. Heavy iron chains attached to manacles, their surfaces pitted with rust and something else, something that might have been dried blood. "Jesus Christ," Elias whispered. his voice strange in the enclosed space. He should have left then, should have climbed those stairs and nailed the door shut again. Instead, he found himself drawn deeper into the room, near the cot, partially hidden beneath a pile of moldering rags. He discovered a leather journal, its pages swollen with moisture. Most of the writing had been rendered illegible by time and damp, but he could make out fragments, dates from the 1860s, mentions of the specimen and remarkable endurance. Tucked between the pages was something that made Elias's heart skip, a simple silver locket on a broken chain. He opened it with numb fingers to find a tiny photograph, the kind traveling photographers used to make. A young woman's face stared back at him, her features indistinct but her eyes dark and arresting even in miniature. Engraved on the back was a name, Nani. Elias pocketed the locket and the journal, then noticed one more thing that made his skin crawl. The wall opposite the stairs bore deep grooves, as if someone had tried to claw their way through solid stone. Below these desperate marks, barely visible in the lantern light, someone had scratched words into the rock. "He comes at night." The chamber suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. Elias backed toward the stairs, his breathing rapid and shallow. This was wrong. All of it. Whatever had happened here, whatever sins had been committed in this underground tomb, they were better left buried. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, burst into the barn, and slammed the trapdoor shut. His hands shook as he scattered hay over it, as if hiding it from view could erase what he'd seen. But as he stumbled out into the clean, cold air of the winter afternoon, Elias knew it was too late. That night, for the first time since Martha's death, he dreamed, not of her gentle face or James's tiny fingers, but of darkness and chains and a woman's voice crying out in a language he didn't understand. He woke with her screams echoing in his ears and the taste of metal in his mouth. Standing at his cabin window, watching snow begin to fall in thick, heavy flakes, Elias fingered the locket in his pocket. He told himself he should throw it away, forget what he'd found, board up the barn and never go near it again. He told himself the past was dead and buried, that whatever secrets his grandfather had kept were none of his concern. But when he closed his eyes, he saw those scratches on the wall, those desperate attempts at escape, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the Wyoming winter, that some things refused to stay buried. The wind picked up again, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling like ghosts across the empty plains. Somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled, and Elias Gentry stood alone in his cabin, holding a dead woman's locket and wondering what sins he had inherited along with this cursed piece of land. The nightmares came every night after that, relentless as the winter storms that battered the ranch. Elias would find himself in the underground chamber, but now he was the one in chains, forced to watch as shadowy figures moved beyond the circle of lamplight. Sometimes he heard a woman's voice speaking in Arapaho, her words urgent and pleading. Other times, he was the one holding the keys, standing over a figure huddled in the corner, and the sick feeling of power that coursed through him in these dreams made him wake, retching. Sleep became his enemy. He took to sitting by the fire through the long nights, drinking coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, his rifle across his lap. But exhaustion was a cruel master, and inevitably his eyes would close. Then he'd be back in that stone chamber, and the worst part was how familiar it began to feel, as if some part of him had always known it was there, waiting. His horses grew nervous around him. Caesar, his black gelding, shied when Elias approached, ears flat against his skull. The barn cat disappeared entirely. Even the wolves seemed to give his property a wider berth, their howls echoing from more distant ridges. By the 3rd week of December, Elias knew he couldn't go on like this. He needed supplies anyway, coffee, ammunition, lamp oil, so he saddled Caesar despite the horse's protests and made the journey to Bitter Creek. The town huddled against the foot of the mountains like a collection of wooden boxes scattered by a careless hand. Main Street was a river of half-frozen mud, and smoke rose from chimneys in straight lines against the gray sky. Elias tied Caesar outside Murphy's general store and stepped inside, grateful for the warmth. He was examining a display of canned goods when he heard a familiar voice. "Mr. Gentry, is that you?" Elias turned to find Clara Whitmore standing near the fabric counter, a basket over her arm. She wore a simple gray dress with a black shawl, her dark hair pinned up beneath a modest bonnet. Her face held that particular combination of strength and sorrow that marked those who had known loss. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Please, it's just Miss Whitmore now," she said softly. "Or Clara, if you prefer. We're not so formal here on the frontier." Elias knew her story. Everyone in Bitter Creek did. She'd come west with her husband, a dreamer who'd planned to start a newspaper, 6 months after their arrival. His wagon had overturned on a mountain road, leaving Clara a widow at 24. That had been 2 years ago. She'd stayed on, teaching at the small schoolhouse, living alone in a cabin at the edge of town, despite the disapproving whispers of more proper folk. "How's the ranch?" she asked, her gray eyes studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "I haven't seen you in town for some time." "Well enough." He lied. Up close, he could see the exhaustion written in the lines around his eyes, the tremor in his hands that he couldn't quite control. Just stocking up before the next storm. Clara glanced toward the window where Caesar stood, then back at Elias. "Your horse looks as though he's seen a ghost," she said lightly, though her expression remained serious. "As do you, if you'll forgive my saying so." Elias forced a laugh. "Nothing a good night's sleep won't cure." "When did you last have one of those?" The question was gentle, but it cut through his defenses like a blade. When he didn't answer, Clara sighed. "I know that look, Mr. Gentry. I wore it myself for months after Robert died. The dead have a way of following us, don't they?" Before he could respond, old Murphy called out that he had Elias's order ready, grateful for the escape. Elias moved to the counter, but Clara followed. "I've heard stories about the old Gentry place," she said quietly, so Murphy wouldn't overhear. "My students tell me things. You know, their grandparents remember when your grandfather lived there. They say—" She paused, seeming to weigh her words. "They say it's a place marked by sorrow." Elias's hand tightened on his money pouch. "Children's tales," he said roughly. "Perhaps." Clara pulled a small bottle from her basket and pressed it into his hand. "Laudanum," she said. "For the sleep. Use it sparingly. It's easy to grow too fond of it. But sometimes we need help fighting our demons." Their fingers touched briefly, and Elias was shocked by the warmth of human contact after so many months alone. He pulled back as if burned. "I don't need— Pride is a cold bedfellow, Mr. Gentry," Clara said simply. "I'll be making my rounds tomorrow, checking on families before Christmas. The Hendricks place is only 3 miles from your ranch. Perhaps I'll stop by with some fresh bread." She didn't wait for his protest, just gathered her purchases and swept out of the store, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and the memory of kind eyes. Elias rode home through gathering dusk, the laudanum bottle heavy in his pocket. He'd intended to throw it away, but that night when the dreams came again, when he found himself holding a woman down while she begged in broken English, he measured out the prescribed dose with shaking hands. The drug brought oblivion rather than rest, a black void where even nightmares couldn't reach. But when he woke, groggy and disoriented, the journal he'd taken from the chamber lay open on his table, though he had no memory of retrieving it. More pages had become legible overnight, as if the heat of the cabin had dried them further. His grandfather's cramped handwriting spelled out fragments of horror. Remarkable constitution, 3 days without water, still she refuses to break. Speaks of spirits, claims they will avenge. Nonsense, of course. Tried to escape again. Measures have been taken. And then, in a different hand, shaky and desperate. "God help me, I think she was right. I see her in the shadows. She watches me. The chamber wasn't deep enough. Nothing could be deep enough to hold what I've—" The entry ended there, the page torn. Elias slammed the journal shut, his stomach churning. "Outside," Caesar whinnied in distress, and he realized with a start that it was well past dawn. He'd lost hours to the laudanum haze. He was mucking out Caesar's stall, trying to work off the drug's lingering effects, when he heard hoofbeats approaching. Clara Whitmore rode up on a bay mare, handling the horse with easy competence. True to her word, she carried fresh bread in her saddlebags, along with a pot of soup. "You look terrible," she said without preamble, swinging down from the saddle. "Thank you for the assessment," Elias said dryly, but he took the food she offered. They stood awkwardly in the barn entrance, and he became acutely aware of how wild he must appear, unshaven, hollow-eyed, his clothes bearing the evidence of restless nights. Clara's gaze drifted past him to the barn's interior, and Elias instinctively moved to block her view, though the trapdoor remained hidden beneath its covering of hay. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" The invitation surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. "I would," she said simply. Inside the cabin, Clara moved with quiet efficiency, reheating the soup while Elias made coffee. They ate in companionable silence, and Elias found himself remembering what it was like to share a meal with another person, to hear the small sounds of someone else existing in his space. "I knew your wife," Clara said eventually. "Not well, but we spoke at church gatherings. She was very kind." "Yes," Elias said. "She was. She wouldn't want this for you." Clara continued gently. "This isolation, this—" She gestured at the rifle propped by the door, the coffee pot that had clearly been emptied and refilled multiple times, the general air of a man under siege. "Whatever you're fighting, you don't have to fight it alone." Elias almost told her then. The words crowded in his throat. About the chamber, the chains, the journal with its hints of torture and madness. But looking at her earnest face, her clean hands folded on his rough table, he couldn't bring that darkness into the light. "Some battles are meant to be fought alone," he said instead. Clara studied him for a long moment, then rose to leave. At the door, she paused. "I lost my husband, Mr. Gentry, but I found that grief shared is grief halved, and guilt—" She seemed to see right through him. "Guilt thrives in isolation. It feeds on silence." After she left, Elias stood in the barn, staring at the hay-covered floor. He could feel it down there, that chamber of horrors, pulling at him like a diseased tooth. He thought of Clara's words, of the warmth in her voice, and for a moment he wavered. Then the wind shifted, and he could swear he heard it again, that woman's voice, crying out from beneath the earth. And he knew that whatever sins lay buried here, they were his to bear now. His inheritance, written in blood and silence. That night, he dreamed he was his grandfather, and the woman in chains looked up at him with Clara Whitmore's eyes. The days between Christmas and New Year passed in a blur of snow and sleepless nights. Elias threw himself into work with desperate energy, repairing fences that didn't need fixing, chopping enough firewood to last 3 winters. Anything to exhaust his body and quiet his mind. But the chamber below the barn pulled at him like a magnetic north, and he found himself standing over the hidden trapdoor at odd hours, listening for sounds that never came. On the 2nd day of January, Clara appeared again, this time bringing medical supplies. She'd noticed the cuts on his hands from his frenzied work, she said, and wouldn't take no for an answer. As she cleaned and bandaged his wounds in the warm light of his kitchen, Elias found himself studying her face, the determined set of her jaw, the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating, the strands of dark hair that escaped her careful pins. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she said, wrapping clean cloth around his palm. "Whatever you're trying to outrun, it'll still be there when you collapse." "Maybe that's what I'm counting on," Elias said without thinking. Clara's hand stilled on his. "Don't say that," she whispered. "Don't even think it." They sat frozen for a moment, her hands warm on his, and Elias felt something crack inside his chest. Not break, exactly, but shift, like ice beginning to thaw. "I lost them," he heard himself say. "Martha and James. I was supposed to protect them, and I failed. And now—" He stopped, jaw clenched. "And now?" Clara prompted gently. Now I'm living in a house built on someone else's sins." He finished, the words bitter as alkali water. Clara released his hand slowly. "We all inherit more than property from our forebears," she said. "My father was a drunk who beat my mother. Robert's family disowned him for marrying beneath his station. But we are not our fathers. Elias, we choose who we become." The use of his Christian name sent a jolt through him. When had he become Elias to her, instead of Mr. Gentry? When had her presence in his home begun to feel natural rather than intrusive? "Stay for supper," he said impulsively. "I've got venison stew and—" He gestured helplessly at the empty cabin. "It's been too quiet here." She stayed, and they talked until the fire burned low. Clara told him about her students, the challenge of teaching children who'd rather be breaking horses than reading books. He found himself sharing memories of Martha he hadn't spoken aloud since her death, how she'd insisted on planting flowers their first spring here, though the wind destroyed them within days, how she'd named every chicken and wept when they had to butcher them, how she'd held baby James up to the window during his first snowfall, whispering about the magic of winter. "She sounds wonderful," Clara said softly. She was. Elias agreed. She was everything good and clean and right. She deserved better than— He gestured at himself, at the cabin, at the whole sorry mess of his existence. "Stop that," Clara said sharply. "Martha loved you. She chose you. Honor that choice by living, not by turning yourself into a monument to grief." They moved to clear the dishes, and in the small space of the cabin, they kept brushing against each other, her sleeve against his arm, his hand grazing hers as they reached for the same plate. Each touch sent sparks through Elias's skin, and he saw his own awareness reflected in the color that rose in Clara's cheeks. She stayed too late, until propriety demanded she leave despite the darkness and cold. Elias saddled her mare while she gathered her things, and they stood awkwardly by the horse, neither wanting to end the evening. "Thank you," Elias said finally. "For the company, for—" He gestured helplessly. "Everything." Clara looked up at him, and something in her expression made his breath catch. "I'll come again," she said. "If you'll have me." "Yes," he said, too quickly. Then, more carefully, "I'd like that." He helped her mount, his hands at her waist, and for a moment she leaned down toward him. He hoped she might kiss him, but instead she touched his cheek gently and rode off into the darkness. Elias stood watching until the hoofbeats faded, his cheek burning where she'd touched it. Back inside. The cabin felt different somehow, as if her presence had shifted the very air. He could smell the faint scent of her lavender soap, see the depression in the chair cushion where she'd sat. For the first time in weeks, he slept without nightmares, but he woke to find himself standing in the barn, fully dressed, a lantern in his hand. The trap door lay open, and his boots were muddy with the particular red clay found only in the chamber below. Heart-pounding, Elias descended the stairs. Everything looked the same, but on the makeshift table he'd fashioned from old boards, he found items he didn't remember placing there: the journal, open to a page he hadn't read before, the locket, polished until it gleamed, and a new addition, a handful of blue beads, the kind the Arapaho used in their ceremonies. The journal entry was dated July 1864. "The woman continues to resist. She speaks of a child left behind. Begs for mercy I cannot grant. The experiments must continue. Doctor, Hartwell assures me that her constitution makes her ideal for our purposes. We seek to understand the savage mind, to find what makes them so resistant to civilization's call. She is our key to pacifying the tribes. When we understand her breaking point, we will understand them all." Elias's gorge rose. Experiments. His grandfather hadn't just imprisoned this woman, he'd tortured her in the name of some twisted science, and a child left behind. The thought of a baby crying for a mother who would never return made him grip the table's edge until his knuckles went white. He climbed from the chamber and slammed the door shut, but he couldn't shut out the knowledge of what lay beneath. Back in the cabin, he paced like a caged animal, Clara's words echoing in his mind. We choose who we become. But how did one choose to be anything other than the inheritor of such evil? How did one wash blood from soil that had drunk deep? The next days passed in a haze. Elias found himself losing time, coming to awareness in strange places, standing by Martha's grave at midnight, sitting in the chamber with no memory of descending, writing letters he didn't remember composing. The laudanum helped him sleep but brought dreams so vivid he couldn't distinguish them from memory. Clara came twice more, and each visit was torture and salvation combined. Her presence anchored him to the present, reminded him that goodness still existed in the world. But he found himself watching her with his grandfather's eyes, imagining her in chains, and the horror of these thoughts made him pull away whenever she came too close. "You're getting worse," she said on her second visit, finding him wild-eyed and fevered. "What aren't you telling me?" "Nothing," he lied. "Just the winter. It gets to a man, being alone." "Then stop being alone," she said, frustration clear in her voice. "Come to town, take a room at the boarding house until spring. Leave this place and its ghosts behind." "I can't," he said, and didn't know how to explain that he was afraid the ghosts would follow. On her third visit, she brought a letter. "From the county records office," she said, placing it on his table. "I took the liberty of inquiring about your grandfather's time here. I thought perhaps knowing more might help you lay the past to rest." Elias opened the letter with trembling hands. It contained copies of official documents, land deeds, tax records, and one item that made his blood freeze. A report from an army captain dated August 1864, noting the disappearance of an Arapaho woman named Nani who'd been working as a translator for the fort. She'd vanished while traveling between the fort and town, leaving behind an infant daughter in the care of her sister. "The woman in the cellar," Elias whispered, forgetting Clara was there. "She had a name. She had a child." "What cellar?" Clara asked sharply. "Elias, what are you talking about?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw not salvation, but another person he would inevitably fail. Another good thing his bloodline would corrupt. "You should go," he said dully. "Don't come back here. Clara, this place, it's not fit for decent people." "I'll decide what's fit for me," she said, but he was already turning away, closing himself off like shuttering a window against a storm. That night, alone again with his ghosts, Elias sat in the chamber with the journal and the locket and the beads. Somewhere out there, Nani's daughter might still live, grown now, never knowing what had become of her mother. The sins of the past stretched forward into the present, an unbroken chain of sorrow. He thought of Clara's touch on his cheek, the warmth in her eyes, and knew he had to choose. Let the darkness take him, or find some way to make amends for crimes that weren't his but whose weight he carried nonetheless. In the corner of the chamber, where the shadows gathered thickest, he could almost see her, Nani, waiting for justice that was 60 years too late. The madness took hold like a fever. Elias dragged bale after bale of hay into the barn, piling them over the trapdoor until a small mountain stood where the entrance had been. Then came the kerosene. Every drop he had stored for his lamps, splashed across the hay with shaking hands. He stood with a lit match, watching it burn down toward his fingers, ready to end it all. The chamber, the barn, maybe himself if the flames took hold. But the match burned his fingers and he dropped it reflexively into the dirt, where it sputtered and died. He tried again, and again the same result. His hands shook too badly to hold the flame steady. On the third attempt, as he fumbled with the matchbox, he heard hoofbeats. Clara rode into view, her mare's breath steaming in the cold afternoon air. She took in the scene, the kerosene-soaked hay, the matches scattered on the ground. Elias wild-eyed and trembling, and dismounted without a word. "Give me the matches," she said quietly, holding out her hand. "You don't understand," Elias said, his voice cracking. "It needs to burn. All of it. The evil in this place. Give me the matches. Elias." Something in her tone, gentle but implacable, made him obey. She pocketed them and then took his arm, leading him away from the barn as one might lead a spooked horse. He didn't resist. all the fight draining out of him at her touch. Inside the cabin, she saw the blood. He'd been cutting himself. He realized distantly, shallow slices along his forearms, some form of penance that made sense only in his fevered mind. Clara made a small sound of distress but said nothing, just heated water and gathered clean cloth as she cleaned his wounds, her hands infinitely gentle. Elias began to speak. The words poured out in a broken flood. The chamber, the chains, his grandfather's journal with its terrible revelations, Nani's story, the child left behind, the experiments conducted in the name of understanding the savage mind, his nightmares, the lost time, the growing certainty that he was becoming his grandfather, that the evil had passed down through blood like a disease. Clara listened without interrupting, her face grave but not disbelieving. When he finished, she secured the last bandage and sat back, studying him. "Show me," she said simply. "No." The refusal was automatic. "I won't take you down there. I'm not a China doll. Elias Gentry," she said sharply. "I've seen darkness. I held my husband's broken body. I've watched children die of diseases that should never touch one so young. Show me this chamber." They cleared enough hay to access the trap door, the kerosene smell making them both light-headed. Elias descended first, holding the lantern high, and heard Clara's sharp intake of breath as she followed. In the chamber, she moved slowly, taking in the chains, the scratches on the walls, the stained floor. She handled the journal with steady hands, reading passages that made her face go pale. When she found the entry about the child, she closed her eyes briefly. "We have to find her," Clara said finally. "The daughter, if she's alive, she deserves to know what happened to her mother." "How?" Elias asked. "It's been 30 years. She could be anywhere, anyone." "The Arapaho were forced onto the Wind River Reservation in 78, Clara said, her teacher's knowledge serving her well. If she survived, that's where she'd be. It's only 2 days' ride north. And then what? I show up and say, 'Pardon me, but my grandfather tortured and murdered your mother.' How does that help anyone?" Clara turned to face him fully, and in the lamplight her eyes were fierce. "It helps because truth matters, because Nani deserves to have her story told, her body properly laid to rest, because her daughter deserves answers, and because you," she touched his chest lightly, "you need to make amends, not for your grandfather's sins, but for your own healing." They climbed from the chamber in silence, back in the cabin. Clara made coffee while Elias sat slumped at the table, exhausted by confession and the weight of what lay ahead. "I'll go with you," Clara said, setting a cup before him. "To the reservation. You shouldn't face this alone." "Why?" Elias looked up at her, genuinely puzzled. "Why do you keep coming back? Why do you care what happens to me?" Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she moved around the table and knelt beside his chair, taking his bandaged hands in hers. "Because I see who you are beneath the guilt and grief," she said softly. "Because loneliness recognizes loneliness. Because when I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to be something other than the tragic widow everyone pities." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Because I've been falling in love with you since that day in Murphy's store. God help me." Elias stared at her, stunned. Then, moving as if in a dream, he slipped from the chair to kneel facing her. He cupped her face in his trembling hands, searching her eyes for any sign of hesitation. "Clara," he breathed. And then they were kissing, desperate and clumsy with need. She tasted of coffee and salvation, and he pulled her against him as if she could anchor him to sanity through touch alone. They broke apart, breathing hard, and Clara laughed shakily. "This is highly improper," she said, but made no move to pull away. "Everything about this is improper." Elias agreed, resting his forehead against hers. "I'm half mad, haunted, probably dangerous." "Hush," Clara said, and kissed him again, softer this time. "You're a good man wrestling with terrible knowledge. There's a difference." They stayed there on the floor, holding each other in the dying light. As shadows lengthened across the cabin, Elias felt something he hadn't experienced since Martha's death. Not happiness, exactly, but the possibility of it. A future beyond guilt and ghosts. But when Clara suggested staying the night, propriety be damned, Elias pulled back. "No," he said quietly. "Not like this. Not while I'm still—" He gestured helplessly. "Broken." Clara studied him, then nodded slowly. "Then we fix what's broken," she said simply. "Starting with that poor woman in the cellar, we go to Wind River, we find her daughter, we bring Nani home. And then?" "And then," Clara said, rising and smoothing her skirts, "we see who you are when you're not carrying the weight of secrets. We see if what's between us is real or just two lonely people clinging to each other in the dark." She left with a last kiss, gentle as a blessing, and Elias stood at his window watching her ride away. The barn loomed in his peripheral vision, but for the first time, it seemed less like a tomb and more like what it was. A building hiding old sins that could be brought to light and laid to rest. That night, he packed for the journey to Wind River. The journal, the locket, the beads, all the evidence of his grandfather's crimes. He would find Nani's daughter. He would tell the truth, no matter how painful. And maybe, just maybe, he could build something clean and new with Clara on the ashes of the past. The nightmares came as always, but now they felt different. Less like possession and more like memory demanding witness. In his dreams, Nani's eyes were sad, but no longer accusing. She seemed to be waiting, patient as the stones that had imprisoned her, for someone to finally say her name aloud and remember. The Bitter Creek Library occupied a narrow building squeezed between the barber shop and the land office. Elias had never set foot inside before, but the elderly librarian, Mrs. Pemberton, seemed unsurprised by his request for historical records. "The Gentry family," she said, peering at him over wire spectacles. "Yes, I remember your grandfather. Not fondly, I'm afraid." She led him to a back room filled with bound newspapers and ledgers. He was not well liked, even among those who shared his views about the Indian question. Elias spent hours combing through yellowed newsprint and faded documents. The picture that emerged made his stomach churn. Josiah Gentry had arrived in Wyoming Territory in 1859, claiming to be a doctor trained back east, though no one had ever verified his credentials. He'd attached himself to various military expeditions as a civilian advisor on native affairs, which seemed to mean he was given license to conduct his cruel studies. An 1864 article in the Territorial Gazette mentioned him obliquely. Dr. J. Gentry continues his researches into the peculiar constitutions of the savage races, work which some claim will advance the cause of civilization, though others question his methods. Another piece, an editorial from 1865, was more direct. "While we support the taming of the wilderness and its inhabitants, we cannot condone the extreme measures reported at the Gentry homestead. Christian charity demands limits, even in war." But it was a notice from September 1864 that stopped Elias cold. Missing Nani, Arapaho woman, aged approximately 20 years, last seen departing Fort Laramie in the company of Dr. J. Gentry, engaged as translator. Any information should be reported to Captain Marcus Webb. Reward offered by the woman's relations. Elias copied down every relevant detail, his hand cramping from the effort. When he finally emerged, Clara was waiting outside, having dismissed her students early. "What did you find?" she asked, falling into step beside him. He handed her the notes, watching her face grow grave as she read. "My grandfather was a monster," he said simply. "And everyone knew it. They just didn't care enough to stop him." "Times were different," Clara began, then stopped. "No, that's no excuse. Evil is evil, whether dressed in a doctor's coat or war paint." They walked in silence to the edge of town, where the Arapaho elder named Joseph Painted Horse lived in a small cabin. He was ancient, his face mapped with deep lines, but his eyes were sharp as obsidian when he opened the door. "You're Josiah Gentry's grandson," he said before Elias could speak. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Elias said. "I need to ask you about a woman named Nani." The old man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them. "Come in," he said finally. Inside, the cabin smelled of sage and tobacco. Joseph gestured for them to sit, then lowered himself carefully into a chair carved with symbols Elias didn't recognize. "Nahtni was my cousin," Joseph said without preamble. "Beautiful, smart. She spoke 4 languages: Arapaho, Lakota, English, some French from the trappers. The army hired her to translate, promised her good wages, protection." He spat into a tin cup. "White man's promises." "Her daughter?" Clara said gently. "Is she—" "Singing Bird lives on the reservation at Wind River," Joseph said. "Married name is Mary Black Kettle. She doesn't speak of her mother. The pain is old but sharp, like an arrowhead that works deeper with time." Elias pulled out the locket. Holding it out with a trembling hand, Joseph took it, opened it, and for the first time his composure cracked. He touched the tiny photograph with one gnarled finger. "I took this picture," he said softly. "Traveled 3 days to find a photographer in Cheyenne." Nani laughed, said it was foolish, but she kept it. He closed the locket and handed it back. "Why do you come here now? Grandson of Josiah Gentry?" Elias told him everything. The chamber, the journal, the remains he was certain lay beneath that stone floor. Joseph listened without interrupting, his face gradually softening from suspicion to something like sorrow. "You carry a burden not of your making," the old man said when Elias finished. "This is good. Too many whites forget the past, or worse, celebrate it. But knowing is not enough. What will you do with this knowledge?" "I want to bring her home," Elias said. "Give her a proper burial. Tell her daughter the truth. If she wants to hear it, try to—" He struggled for words. "Make some kind of amends." Joseph studied him for a long moment. Then he rose and went to a wooden chest in the corner. From it, he withdrew a bundle wrapped in deerskin. "These were Nani's," he said, unwrapping a beaded necklace, a small leather pouch, and an eagle feather. "I saved them for Singing Bird, but she would not take them. Too much pain. Maybe now." He rewrapped the items carefully. "I will go with you to Wind River. An old man's words carry weight, and Nani was my blood. I should have looked for her harder, longer. We all carry our failures." They arranged to leave in 3 days. As Elias and Clara walked back to town, she slipped her hand into his. "You did well," she said softly. "I haven't done anything yet," Elias replied. "You listened. You believed. You're trying to make it right." She squeezed his hand. "That's more than most would do." That evening, Elias returned to the ranch alone. Despite Clara's offer to stay, he needed to prepare, he told her, but really he needed to face the chamber one more time with clear eyes. He descended with a lantern and a shovel. The stone floor had seemed solid, but now, knowing what he was looking for, he could see the irregularities, places where stones had been removed and replaced. He chose a spot near the wall with the scratches and began to dig. The work was hard, the stones heavy and tightly fitted, but grief and determination gave him strength. An hour in, his shovel struck something that wasn't stone or earth, carefully, dreading what he'd find but unable to stop. He cleared away the dirt. Cloth appeared first, remnants of what might have been a dress, then bones, delicate and undeniably human. Elias worked with increasing care, uncovering the remains with the reverence they deserved. Nani had been wrapped in what looked like a blanket, now mostly rotted away, and placed in a shallow grave carved from the bedrock itself. Near what would have been her chest, he found them, strands of beads that matched those he'd discovered earlier, and clutched in finger bones, a small wooden carving of a horse, a child's toy. He realized she'd been holding her daughter's toy when she died. Elias knelt there in the lamplight, surrounded by the evidence of old horror, and wept for Nani, for her daughter, for his grandfather's victims and his grandfather's twisted soul, for Martha and James, who he'd failed to save, for himself, carrying the weight of inherited sin. And for Clara, brave enough to love him despite it all. When his tears were spent, he carefully covered the remains again. Soon, he promised silently, soon you'll rest somewhere clean, beneath open sky, with your true name spoken over your bones. He climbed from the chamber and stood in the barn, breathing hard. Through the gaps in the walls, he could see stars appearing in the darkening sky. Tomorrow, he would ride to Wind River with Clara and Joseph. He would face Singing Bird, Mary Black Kettle, and tell her the truth her mother had never been able to speak. And whatever came after, forgiveness or condemnation, peace or continued haunting, at least the truth would finally walk free beneath the wide Wyoming sky. The journey to Wind River took 2 days through country that shifted from snow-covered plains to the sheltered valleys where the Arapaho had made their homes. Joseph Painted Horse rode ahead on his paint pony, back straight despite his years. While Elias and Clara followed side by side, they'd barely spoken since morning, the weight of what lay ahead rendering words inadequate. At the reservation boundary, they were met by tribal police, young Arapaho men in mixed traditional and military dress who recognized Joseph and waved them through with curious glances at his white companions. The settlement spread along the river, a collection of wooden houses and traditional lodges, smoke rising from fires that fought back the February cold. Mary Black Kettle lived in a small frame house at the settlement's eastern edge. When she opened the door, Elias saw Nani's eyes looking back at him, the same dark depth, the same proud bearing despite the gray threading through her hair. She was near 50 now, with grown children of her own visible behind her in the doorway. "Uncle," she said to Joseph in English, her voice carefully neutral. "And guests." Joseph spoke rapidly in Arapaho. Elias caught Nani's name and saw Mary's face close like a slammed door. She replied sharply in the same language, gesturing for them to leave. But Joseph persisted, his voice gentle but insistent. Finally, Mary stepped aside. "Come in," she said in English. "But I tell you now, I have no wish to hear of the dead." Inside, the house was warm and clean, with beaded artwork on the walls and the smell of fry bread from the kitchen. Mary's children, a young man and 2 teenage girls, watched the visitors with open curiosity until their mother sent them outside with a few sharp words. They sat at a wooden table covered with an embroidered cloth. Mary served coffee in silence, her movements precise and controlled. When all were seated, she fixed Elias with a stare that made him want to look away. "You have his face," she said. "Josiah Gentry. I saw him once when I was very small. My aunt brought me to Fort Laramie. He was there with my mother." Her voice remained steady, but her knuckles were white around her cup. "That was the last time I saw her." Elias pulled out the journal, the locket, and the wooden horse he'd found clutched in Nani's remains. He placed them on the table between them. Mary's composure cracked at the sight of the carved toy. "I made this," she whispered, touching it with trembling fingers. "My first carving. Mother said she would carry it always, to remember me while she worked for the whites." She looked up, tears streaming down her face. "What did he do to her?" Elias told her, sparing nothing but the worst details. Mary listened in stone-faced silence, but Clara quietly wept, and even Joseph's weathered face showed pain. When Elias finished describing how he'd found Nani's remains still clutching the toy, Mary rose abruptly and walked to the window. "All my life, I wondered," she said, her back to them. "Some said she ran off with a white man, others that she'd been killed by soldiers or bandits. My aunt who raised me forbade me to ask questions, said it would only bring pain." She turned, and her face was fierce. "But not knowing was worse. Every woman I passed, I wondered, could that be her? Every story of a lost Indian. I thought, maybe that was Mother. The not knowing ate at me like a disease." She returned to the table, sitting heavily. "You say you want to bring her home. Why? What do you gain?" "Nothing," Elias said honestly. "I gain nothing but the hope that some small part of this wrong can be made right. Your mother deserves a proper burial, her story told, her name remembered. You deserve the truth and the chance to mourn." Mary studied him for a long moment. And you? What do you deserve? Grandson of Josiah Gentry? Clara started to speak, but Elias touched her hand to stop her. I deserve whatever judgment you render, he said simply. I've benefited from his crimes, lived on land bought with blood money, inherited wealth built on suffering. I can't undo that, but I can try to, he struggled for words, to break the chain, to choose differently. Mary was quiet for so long that Elias thought she might order them out. Then she spoke, her voice soft but firm. In our way, we believe the dead must be properly honored or their spirits wander, lost and lonely. My mother, her voice broke. My mother has been wandering for 30 years. Yes, bring her home. The rest happened quickly. Mary gathered her family and other relatives. Joseph sent word through the settlement, and by evening, a small group had assembled. Elders, spiritual leaders, and those who remembered Nani or had heard her story. They would travel together to the ranch, conduct the proper ceremonies, and bring Nani's remains back for burial among her people. That night, Clara and Elias were given space in Joseph's nephew's home. They sat together on a wooden bench outside, wrapped in a single blanket against the cold, watching stars wheel overhead. I'm proud of you, Clara said softly. I haven't done anything to be proud of. Elias replied, I'm just trying to clean up a mess I didn't make but can't ignore. Clara turned to face him, her eyes serious in the moonlight. That's exactly why I'm proud. Most men would have kept the secret, sold the land, moved on. You're choosing the harder path. With you beside me, Elias said, pulling her closer. I don't think I could do this alone. You're not alone, she said firmly. Not anymore. They kissed then, gentle and sweet, a promise of futures possible once the past was laid to rest. When they finally parted, Clara rested her head on his shoulder. What happens after? She asked. After Nani is buried, after the ceremonies are done? I don't know. Elias admitted. I can't stay on that land, not knowing what I know. But I can't just walk away either. Maybe. He paused, working through thoughts that had been forming since they'd arrived at Wind River. Maybe the land should go back to her people. It's not enough. God knows. But it's something. Clara lifted her head to look at him. You'd give up your ranch? It was never really mine. Elias said, it was bought with blood and held with silence. Maybe it's time it served a better purpose. And us? Clara asked softly. What happens to us? Elias cupped her face gently. I hope we build something new, something clean, away from the shadows. He kissed her forehead. If you'll have me, broken as I am. We're all broken. Clara said, the beauty is in how we mend. The next morning, the group set out for the Gentry Ranch, a strange procession of Arapaho riders and 2 whites, united in the grim purpose of reclaiming the dead. Mary rode beside Elias for part of the journey, asking questions about her mother's final days that he answered as best he could from the journal's terrible record. She never stopped fighting, he told her. The journal makes that clear. She never gave him what he wanted, never broke, never betrayed her people's ways. She died strong. Mary nodded, tears freezing on her cheeks in the bitter wind. That sounds like the mother I remember, strong as the mountain, gentle as morning light. She looked at him sideways. You are not your grandfather, Elias Gentry. Remember that when the darkness comes calling. As they neared the ranch, Elias felt the familiar dread settling over him like a shroud. But this time, he wasn't facing it alone. This time he was part of something larger, a reckoning, a homecoming, a laying to rest of ghosts that had haunted 2 peoples for far too long. The barn loomed before them, and beyond it, the chamber waited. But now it seemed less like a tomb and more like what it truly was, a prison whose door was finally about to open, releasing both captive and captor into the possibility of peace. The work of exhuming Nani's remains took place in sacred silence. The Arapaho elders directed the process, with Elias and several younger men carefully removing the stones and earth that had hidden her for 30 years. Mary stood at the chamber's entrance, unable to descend but unwilling to leave, her lips moving in continuous prayer. When they finally lifted Nani's body, wrapped in new blankets provided by her people, the afternoon sun slanted through the barn's gaps like benediction. They carried her into the light, and Mary fell to her knees, keening in a way that spoke of grief too long contained. The sound raised the hair on Elias's neck, not frightening, but profoundly moving. A mother's stolen goodbye finally given voice through her daughter. They laid Nani in a lodge specially erected for the ceremony. The women took over then, preparing her with the rites denied her in death. Clara stayed with them at Mary's invitation, while Elias found himself standing uselessly in his own yard, watching his home become a place of healing rather than horror. Joseph Painted Horse approached, laying a gnarled hand on Elias's shoulder. "You did a good thing," the old man said, "but the work is not finished." "What more can I do?" Elias asked. "That chamber must be cleansed." Joseph said, "The evil done there has seeped into the stones. It must be purified, or it will call to other darkness." Over the next 3 days, Elias worked to transform the chamber. Under Joseph's guidance, they burned sage and sweetgrass, the smoke filling every corner. The chains and instruments of captivity were removed, to be destroyed according to Arapaho custom. The walls were washed with sacred water, prayers spoken over every stone, but it was Elias's own addition that surprised everyone. He'd spent the nights painting, not with any great skill, but with determined purpose. On the walls where scratches had spoken of desperation, he painted images of freedom, horses running across open plains, eagles soaring above mountains, the sun breaking through storm clouds, and on the wall where Nani had written, "He comes at night," Elias painted stars, hundreds of them, transforming the darkness into light. "She loved the stars," Mary said, when she finally found the courage to descend and see where her mother had died. She touched the painted constellations with wondering fingers. "She taught me their names in our language, said they were the spirits of ancestors watching over us." She turned to Elias, tears on her face, but something like peace in her eyes. "You've made this a memorial, not a tomb." The burial took place at sunset on the 3rd day, in a hillside grove of cottonwoods that overlooked the river. The entire Arapaho delegation attended, along with Clara and, surprisingly, several townspeople from Bitter Creek who had heard what was happening and come to pay respects. Mrs. Pemberton, the librarian, stood with tears streaming down her face. "I remember her," she whispered to Elias. "She came to town once with dispatches. Such a lovely young woman. We all wondered what became of her." The ceremony blended Arapaho tradition with touches Mary requested. They buried Nani with her belongings, the beads, the locket with her photograph, and the wooden horse she'd carried to the end. Joseph spoke in Arapaho, his voice carrying across the snow-covered hills, telling Nani's story so that all would remember. Mary sang a death song taught to her by her aunt, her voice breaking but never stopping. When it came time for final words, Mary surprised everyone by asking Elias to speak. He stood by the grave, hat in his hands, searching for words. "I cannot apologize for my grandfather," he said finally. "His crimes are beyond apology, but I can promise that Nani's story will not be forgotten, that this land where she suffered will know no more chains, no more darkness, that her daughter and her people will always be welcome here, for as long as grass grows and water flows." He paused, swallowing hard. "And I promise that the evil ends with me. No child of mine will inherit this legacy of cruelty. The chain breaks here." After the burial, as people shared food and memories around fires that pushed back the winter darkness, Mary approached Elias and Clara where they sat apart from the others. "I have thought much these past days," she said, settling beside them. "About anger and forgiveness, about how poison passes from one generation to the next if we let it." She looked at Elias directly. "You are not responsible for your grandfather's evil, but you chose to take responsibility for making it right. That is a rare thing among your people, among any people." She pulled something from her bag, a beaded band worked with intricate patterns. "This is for you," she said, pressing it into Elias's hands. "It tells the story of transformation, of winter becoming spring, of endings that become beginnings. She smiled sadly. My mother would have liked knowing someone finally came looking for her, even if it took 30 years. As the gathering began to disperse, Elias found himself in deep conversation with several Arapaho men about the future of the ranch. Word of his intention to return the land had spread, met with skepticism at first, then cautious interest. By evening's end, they had the framework of an agreement. The land would be held in trust for any Arapaho who wished to run cattle or horses there, with Elias teaching what he knew of ranching before departing. That night, in the empty ranch house with Clara beside him, Elias felt lighter than he had in months. They made plans by candlelight, a small house in town where Clara could continue teaching and Elias could start fresh, perhaps as a carpenter or wheelwright. Simple work with his hands, building rather than inheriting. "Are you sure?" Clara asked, tracing patterns on his chest as they lay entwined. "This is a lot of land to give up. Your children—" "Our children," Elias corrected, making her breath catch. "Our children will have something better than blood-stained land. They'll have parents who chose love over fear, truth over silence. That's worth more than any ranch." She kissed him then, deep and sure, and they made love with a tenderness that felt like healing. Later, as Clara slept in his arms, Elias stared at the ceiling and thought about transformation, how his grandfather's chamber of horrors had become a place of art and remembrance, how a story of captivity had become one of liberation, how two broken people had found wholeness in each other. The next morning brought unexpected visitors, a delegation from Bitter Creek, led by the mayor and including several prominent citizens, arrived as Elias and Clara were preparing to accompany the Arapaho party back to Wind River. "We've heard what you're doing here," the mayor said uncomfortably. "This business with the Indian woman, giving land back to the tribe. People are talking." "Let them talk," Elias said evenly. "Now see here, Gentry," one of the ranchers broke in. "Your grandfather was one of the founders of this territory. What you're doing, it's a betrayal of your own kind." "My grandfather was a torturer and murderer," Elias said flatly. "If that's my kind, then yes, I am betraying it gladly." The men shifted uneasily, but Mrs. Pemberton stepped forward from behind them. "What Mr. Gentry is doing is Christian charity of the highest order," she said firmly, "acknowledging sin and making amends. You'd all do well to examine your own consciences before casting stones." In the end, the delegation left without achieving whatever they'd hoped for, threats or persuasion to maintain the status quo. But their visit clarified something for Elias. He and Clara couldn't stay in Bitter Creek. Too many people there would always see him as Josiah Gentry's grandson first, everything else second. Colorado, Clara said that evening as they watched the sunset paint the mountains crimson. "Denver's growing. They need teachers and carpenters. We could start truly fresh." Elias pulled her close, breathing in the lavender scent of her hair. "Yes," he said simply, "a new start." That night, he returned to the chamber one last time. It looked nothing like the torture cell he'd discovered months ago. The painted walls caught the lantern light, making the horses seem to run. The eagles soar, where chains had hung. Mary had placed sacred items, prayer feathers, beaded work telling Nani's story in symbols Elias couldn't read but somehow understood. He'd thought to leave the journal here, a testament to evil transformed, but something made him pocket it again. Evidence, perhaps, or reminder. Some truths were too important to bury, even in a cleansed grave. As he climbed the stairs for the last time, Elias felt a presence, not threatening now, but peaceful. A whisper that might have been wind or might have been a woman's voice saying thank you in a language older than his people's presence on this land. "Rest well, Nani," he said to the darkness. "Your story is told. Your daughter knows. The chain is broken. And somewhere in the painted stars on the chamber walls, a spirit finally found its way home. Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it arrived, it transformed the landscape with violent beauty. Snowmelt turned creeks into torrents, and the first wildflowers pushed through the sodden earth with desperate urgency. Elias and Clara stood on the porch of their new home in Denver, watching the Front Range peaks shed their white mantles like old grief finally released. The house was modest, 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it was theirs, bought with honest money from the sale of Elias's cattle and horses. The ranch itself had been transferred to the Wind River Arapahoe, with Mary Black Kettle and her family taking responsibility for its management. They ran horses there now. Mary had ridden, and her children learned to ride where their grandmother had died, transforming a place of sorrow into one of life. Clara's hand found Elias's, her fingers intertwining with his carpenter-calloused ones. 3 months married, and still the simple touch sent warmth through him. "Any regrets?" she asked, as she did sometimes when she caught him staring at the mountains. "None," he said, and meant it. "Though I do miss the stars. Can't see them as well here in the city. Then we'll have to visit the mountains." Clara said, "When school lets out for summer, we could camp, like we did on the way here." That journey from Wyoming had been its own form of healing. 10 days through raw spring country, just the 2 of them and their horses and the vast sky overhead. They'd married in Cheyenne, a simple ceremony with strangers for witnesses, but their real wedding had been those nights under the stars, learning each other's bodies and hearts with patient tenderness. "Mrs. Gentry," a voice called from the street, their neighbor. Mrs. Chen, whose husband ran a laundry and whose English was flavored with Cantonese, waved from her garden. "You have letter." Clara hurried down to collect it, returning with an envelope bearing Mary Black Kettle's careful script. They read it together, standing in the doorway. "Dear friends, I hope this finds you well in your new life. The ranch prospers. My eldest son David has proved natural with horses, and we have sold 3 to the army for good price. The chamber you transformed has become something unexpected, a place of teaching. We bring our young ones there to learn the history, both dark and light. Your paintings remain, and we have added our own. It is no longer a wound, but a scar, healed over but remembered. I write with news you should hear. Clara, you asked about children of your body that might not come. I have spoken with our medicine woman. She says the sorrow you carry from losing your first has left shadows. But shadows can be lifted. She has sent herbs and instructions. Whether you believe or not, what harm in trying? Also, Elias, your story has traveled. Other families have come forward with tales of those who vanished in the settlement years. Some seek only truth. Others seek what you gave us, a chance to bring their lost ones home. I tell them you are gone to Denver, but if any find you, perhaps you will hear them as you heard us. The cottonwoods where mother rests are leafing out green and strong. Joseph Painted Horse sits there often, smoking and talking to her. He says she is at peace. He says to tell you the dreams will fade now. The debt is paid. Walk in beauty. Mary Black Kettle. Clara pressed the letter to her chest, tears sliding down her cheeks. The question of children was a quiet grief between them. The doctor in Denver had been blunt. Her miscarriage during her first marriage had left scarring. Children were unlikely, though not impossible. Should we try? She asked. The herbs. What harm in trying? Elias echoed Mary's words, kissing Clara's forehead. Though you should know, children or no children, you are enough. You are everything. That evening, as Clara prepared the herbal tea according to Mary's instructions, filling their small kitchen with strange, earthy scents, Elias worked on his latest project. He'd taken up furniture making, finding peace in shaping wood into useful beauty. This piece was special, a cradle, though he hadn't told Clara. Hope carved in pine and oak, waiting for possibility. A knock at the door interrupted his sanding. A young man stood on the porch, hat in hands, travel-stained and weary. Behind him waited an older woman, clearly his mother, with the distinctive features of the Cherokee. Mr. Gentry? Elias Gentry? The young man asked. Yes. My name is Thomas Downing. This is my mother, Sarah. We've come from Kansas. We heard That is, the Arapaho woman Mary Black Kettle told us. He stopped, gathering himself. My grandmother disappeared in 1868. She was Osage, working as a guide for settlers. A doctor hired her, said he needed someone who knew the healing plants. She never came home. Elias felt the familiar chill, the shadow of his grandfather's evil stretching longer than he'd imagined. "Come in," he said quietly. "Tell me everything you know." They talked until midnight. Sarah Downing had her mother's journal, her last entries mentioning a doctor. Gentry, who promised good wages for knowledge of native medicines. The timeline fit, the methods matched. Another woman vanished into his grandfather's darkness. "I can't bring her back," Elias said finally. "But I can tell you what I know of his methods, where you might search." Sarah Downing's face was stone. "We don't seek revenge, Mr. Gentry. Only truth, only to bring her home, as you brought Nani home." After they left, with promises to write and share what they discovered. Elias sat with Clara in their small parlor. She'd heard everything, her face grave but not surprised. "There will be others," she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he had 20 years to practice his evil. How many vanished? How many families still wonder? "Then we help them," Clara said simply. "We bear witness. We assist in the searching. We transform your inheritance from blood money to blood justice." Elias pulled her close, marveling again at her strength. "I don't deserve you," he murmured into her hair. "Stop that," she said firmly. "We've discussed this. You are not your grandfather. You are the man who chose to break the chain." Summer arrived in a blaze of heat and hope. Clara's school term ended, and they made good on their plan to camp in the mountains. For a week they lived simply, fishing in crystal streams and sleeping under stars so thick they seemed touchable. On their last night, as they lay by the dying fire, Clara took his hand and placed it on her belly. "The herbs worked," she whispered. Or maybe it was time, or maybe it was finally being free of old grief. "But Elias, we're going to have a child." He pulled her against him, joy and terror warring in his chest. A child. New life to balance old death, the chain broken and reforged in love. They returned to Denver to prepare. Elias worked long hours, crafting furniture to sell, saving every penny. Clara nested, transforming their small home into a haven. And always, the letters came, families seeking answers, following the trail of whispers that said Elias Gentry would help them find their lost ones. By autumn, he'd assisted 3 more families in locating remains, guided by his grandfather's journal and the terrible knowledge it contained. Each discovery was anguish and relief intertwined. Each burial was a step toward balance. October brought the first snow and Clara's labor. 12 hours of struggle and fear. The doctor coming and going with increasing concern. Elias paced their small parlor like a caged wolf, praying to any god that would listen. Christian, Arapaho, spirits of earth and sky, to spare her, to spare them both. Then, as dawn broke over the mountains, a cry split the air. Not Clara's, but something new and fierce and absolutely alive. The doctor emerged, exhausted but smiling. "A daughter," he said, "small but strong. And your wife as well, though she'll need rest." Elias rushed to the bedroom to find Clara propped against pillows, hair plastered to her head with sweat, face glowing with exhausted triumph. In her arms lay a bundle of blankets containing the smallest, most perfect human he'd ever seen. "Meet your daughter," Clara whispered, transferring the precious weight to his arms. The baby opened her eyes, dark like Clara's, but with something of Martha in them too. And perhaps, though it might have been fancy, a touch of Nani's fierce spirit. All the women who'd shaped this moment, present in miniature features and grasping fingers. "What shall we name her?" Clara asked. Elias thought of chains broken and stories told, of winter becoming spring and endings transformed to beginnings. "Hope," he said. "Hope, Nani Gentry. For all the women who didn't get to see their daughters grow. For the future we're building on the ashes of the past." Clara smiled, touching their daughter's cheek with one gentle finger. "Hope it is." Outside, Snow began to fall, blanketing Denver in clean white, but inside their small home, warmth reigned. Elias sat beside his wife and child, thinking of the long journey from that dark chamber to this bright moment. His grandfather's journal lay locked in a drawer, still consulted when families came seeking. The past wasn't buried. It was transformed, made useful in the service of truth and justice. "I love you," he told Clara, told Hope, told the world beyond their walls. "Both of you. All of this, even the sorrow that brought us here. That's the secret," Clara murmured, already half asleep. "Loving all of it, the dark and light together. That's how we win." Hope stirred in his arms, making soft baby sounds of contentment. Somewhere in Wyoming, snow would be falling on a cottonwood grove where Nani rested, on a ranch where Arapaho children learned to ride, on a painted chamber that had become a place of teaching rather than terror. The chain was broken. The story was told. And in a small house in Denver, a new chapter began with a baby's cry and a father's tears of joy. The past would always be with them, carved in scars and painted in stars. But the future stretched ahead, bright with possibility. Elias Gentry looked down at his daughter and made her a promise. "You will know only love, only truth, only the freedom to become whoever you choose to be." And in the morning light filtering through snow-traced windows, with his girls safe in his arms, it felt like a promise he could keep. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the untamed heart of the American West. If you're listening to this tale of redemption and love conquering the darkest shadows of the past, I'd love to know where in the world you're hearing these words. Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire and share your thoughts below, whether you're by a real campfire or just dreaming of frontier skies. Let's keep these stories alive together.